systemic design, you're not designing anything. You are just designing intervention into a system.
Hello everyone, welcome to Green I/O, the podcast for responsible technologists building a greener digital world, one bite at a time. Every 2 Tuesdays, our guests from across the globe share insights, tools, and alternative approaches, enabling people within the tech sector and beyond to boost digital sustainability. You know, when I discuss with fellow digital sustainability enthusiasts about sustainable design, I often hear these statements. It's systemic. We need to see the big picture beyond our own company, on our own clients. We need to change fundamentally the way we think design if we want to design for a better future. We must move from human-centered to planet-centered design. I couldn't agree more. But I also recall a conversation I had some months ago with a researcher in economics. We were talking about Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in System, and her position was, well, let's say abrupt. It's a good idea on paper, but it's not operational, you cannot modelize it. So I was wondering, how operational is it for us working in the digital sector? How do we transform into actions the statements which I listed previously? And to answer these questions, I'm glad to be joined today by two experts in systemic design, Sylvie Daumal and Thorsten Jonas. Sylvie is based in Paris, and she is somehow a rock star in France when it comes to systemic design, a field she has been investigated since the early 2000s. She wrote a book last year, 58 Tools for Systemic Design, a very technical book which has been acclaimed in the French design community. And on a more personal note, I'm so happy that we managed to record this episode, which has been rescheduled 4 times. I think record broken. Thorsten is based in Hamburg. He has been in UX design for almost 20 years, if not more than 20 years, and he founded the Sustainable UX Network 2 years ago, a community who has gathered an impressive momentum with more than 2,000 very active members across Europe and all over the world. We share quite a lot with Thorsten, who is a fellow podcaster, a fellow speaker, a fellow community builder, and whom I see the name popping on every cool event I'd like to join. And yet, we didn't manage to meet until today, despite me spending quite a lot of time in Hamburg when I was working with my former Imovelt colleagues. So, welcome, Sylvie. Welcome, Thorsten. Thanks a lot for joining Green I/O today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Gaël.
So, big question I stated in the introduction. How can we make systemic design operational? And maybe, before jumping on the question, maybe we should remind what is systemic design and why is it useful? Sylvie, do you want to start maybe with some kind of a definition?
Systemic design is dedicated to handling complex systems, complex questions, complex issues. It is used mostly when you have question about any kind of subject that are involving many people, that are involving many parts. The fact is that systemic thinker are people who have a special angle to see things. The system is not really existing by its own. It's just the way that you see the things. And what is the big characteristic of system is the fact that you identify many parts in a situation, and all the parts are in interaction one with the other. That's the reason why it is most of the time complex, because it creates what we call causal loops. It means that one cause can have a consequence will have a cause on another part of the system, and so on. So at the very end, you can see that every action, every interaction has a consequence on the whole system. So it's a way to really envision the whole situation. But most of the time, all the problems are complex.
Which makes it useful also for digital design, digital services. Thorsten, I think that's something that you've advocated again and again and again in your public speaking these last years, that we need to embrace systemic thinking also when we design digital services. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on this?
Sure. I think one of the key things of UX design is that we focus on the user, right? We want to build great experiences, great products for our users. And that's what we advocate for, and that's what we try to make other stakeholders understand, that it's valuable to focus on the user and to fulfill the user's needs. And we do this for many years. The problem is, by focusing so much on the user, we totally forget about all the other actors that are somehow influenced by the product, by the experience that we build. So all the tools we use in UX are not taking into account the systemic context of the product, of the experience that we build, right? And another actor could be a human being, could also be the planet, the environment, whatever, everything that is influenced by what we build. And I think this is a really big problem, because very often someone or something else pays the price for the good user experience we build for our users. Let's say I build a nice service and a nice app for ordering my groceries from home, right? So there are several big services out there that do this, and they are advertising pretty aggressive. And you could say it's a good user experience and it's very convenient for the user. I'm just sitting on my couch. I can order my groceries via app, and then maybe 30 minutes later, someone shows up at my door, and the only thing I have to do is walking up to my door and pick up the stuff. But who pays the price? Well, it's the delivery riders that are not paid well, that are for a long time even not employed, but so-called self-employed. These services have a very aggressive price policy, so it cannot be matched by the small grocery stores we have here in our big cities, etc., etc. So there is, for the convenience and for the great user experience, someone or something else pays the price. And that is something I think we in UX for too long have not taken into account. And as I said in the beginning, it's not part of our tools, and we need to enhance our tools and maybe create new tools to put this into our work, to make, in the first place, to understand the systemic context, to understand the consequences, maybe the unintended consequences of what we build, to be able to do it better and to do a better job there and to do less harm in the end.
And how would you do that? Do you have some tools that you like to use? And I know we could drop it later, but let's drop it earlier because it makes, you know, some impact, I would say, in the design world, with Apple in its last conference using, I think, at that scale for the very first time, a non-human person now with Mother Earth. And I'm not going to comment on the message itself, but more than the way they convened the message, which was using a non-human person. Is it a tool that you've been using sometime, Thorsten, or do you think about other kind of tool?
This is one of the tools, because the great thing about non-human personas is that we use a tool we are very used to from our daily work and just reframe it a little bit to give other actors in our system, let's say, a voice, right? And it's always easier to use an existing tool and to enhance it than introducing a totally new tool. It's easier for all of our processes. It's easier for our work with stakeholders. As you said a little bit, there was so much things wrong about this, but still it was for people like us very helpful, because now people like us can go to clients or wherever and say, hey, what about non-human or non-user personas? And maybe in the past people laughed at us when we said, hey, let's make a persona for Mother Nature or for the environment or for trees or the river. Now we can say, hey, yeah, but that's what Apple did, and nobody is laughing anymore. So I still see a big advantage that Apple does this. But this is just one tool, and so something that's very helpful for me is when starting working on a product or on an experience. So as I said before, we are focusing so much on the user and user needs, and then maybe we try to align this with the business needs that someone else finds very important. And so this is what we do. And I think we need to add here, what are the unintended or maybe even known consequences of these things? So what are negative impacts of this certain user need? So this is a tool I use pretty often, and actually a framework I was and I am still working on, to be able to see the user needs and the business needs, and in the same framework or in the same canvas see, okay, but what are the negative consequences on a societal, on an ecological, and also on a single human level, right? Because very often we also build great user experiences which are in the end harmful for ourselves, looking at endless scrolling, looking at TikTok, YouTube, etc., that try to keep us inside of the platform as long as possible and stealing our time. So this is a very helpful tool for me, mapping our user and business needs to the negative consequences of these. And third tool I use very often is, and that's what I used before building the non-human personas. Actually, it's also very simple mapping. Think about, put your product or your experience in the middle, and then think about all the actors, direct or indirect, that are influenced by the product that I built. So it's a very simple exercise, but it creates a lot of transparency and visibility about this. And this is, from my experience, very important to do these things in the very beginning of the design process, because it helps open up our minds that are so focused on the users, and helps us to understand, okay, there is so much more we need to understand. And one last tool that is very helpful is using the user journey that we use a lot in UX, and adding additional layers. So, for example, which actors are influenced at this step in the user journey? What is the environmental impact at this step of the user journey? So it breaks the very, let's say, more high-level view from the beginning down to certain steps in the user journey, and helps us to work on certain ideas. Where can we do things better?
So if I wrap up the 4 tools you've listed, there is obviously the non-human persona. You would say that the first one you use is this kind of actor mapping, like full-scale actors, both direct and indirect, being impacted by the service mapping.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then you have this mapping, and this is, well, that's quite hard to explain.
I call it unintended consequence mapping.
Okay, this is what you go from the business need and the user needs, and you go to the environmental and societal impact.
Yeah, you can do this in 2 steps. You can also map the unintended consequences without the user needs and business needs. So this works also. But then the next step that is very helpful is to try to find connections to these metrics that we use every day, right? The user needs and the business needs. So that's why I put this in there. But you can do this in 2 steps. But yeah, it's unintended consequence mapping, and then the second step, map these to user needs and business needs, or connect.
Sylvie, do these tools resonate a bit, or do you tend to use other tools? And I know that you've got 58 tools at your disposal, so you've got quite But does it ring a bell, or are there different tools that you use? Because for the listeners, what I didn't say in the introduction is that, of course, you know quite well digital design, but you're also an expert in the brick and mortar world, I would say.
Firstly, there are much more than the 58 that I describe in the book. I had to do a selection, so I could add probably easily 40 more. The second point is my question is a bit different from the question that is the one of Thorsten. My main concern is about the fact that in 2015 all the parties met in Paris for the COP21, and they all decided to sign what is called now Paris Agreement. And according to this agreement, we now have 6 years to divide our our greenhouse effect gas, to divide them by 2. It means that for me, any project that you can have now in a country, in a company, and could be any kind of territory, in a school, wherever you work, must be in this trajectory. There is no way to think about the fact that everything that we are doing must help us to divide our emission by 2. So my question is much more about how do we guarantee the fact that every project helps us to attain this goal. So my question is very different from does it hurt someone? My question is, are we sure that we are going to a place where everyone can live?
You work as a consultant with many companies. So, how do you manage these very important goals to be taken into account, and how systemic design tools help?
The fact is that you start with carbon assessment. It is not mandatory in the companies in France. I cannot tell for Europe, but in France it's mandatory. So you start, that's your starting point. And you check from this document, that is most of the time a public document, where are the sources of emission, and you work with all the people who are involved in this emission. It can be producers, it can be providers, it can be the company itself. It can come from many parts, and you start asking the question: how can I do better? How can I remove things? That's the first. The starting point. Also, most of the companies today are facing lack in many things. We all know that all the raw materials have their price increasing incredibly during the last few years. So the question is, how can we still produce what we are producing if the price are still increasing in the next months or in the next years? And the last point is, how can we be compliant with all the new rules and the new laws that are arriving and that are also putting a big pressure on the companies? And for the tools that you use, you have many tools that have been created by a guy called Hassan Özbekhan when he was working with Alexander Christakis. These tools are called structure dialogic design, and they are based on the fact that you need to gather all the people who are concerned and make them talk and really discuss and make them imagine the solutions. And yes, that's the kind of tools that you can easily use when you are working in such issues.
And among them, could you give us one example of a tool you used recently just to grasp it? Because it might sound a bit blurry for people not being familiar with systemic design. And I know that for you, it's extremely concrete.
Okay. Like in UX design, systemic design start with a research. So you have a long time researching, exploring the issue. And from this research, you create what is called a white book. And a white book is a kind of synthesis of the problem, of the situation, of the context. This tools is given to all the people that participate to a workshop. This is a very simple tool. You can create it in, I could say, almost any kind of design project. But the fact is that it gives to all the participants the pieces of information that most of the time they do not have because they have their own expertise, but they do not know everything about the subject. So it helps to align all the participants to the workshop to have the same level of information. That's a very easy and simple tool that any designer can create.
Thorsten, the emphasis that Sylvie has put on people talking to each other, is it also an issue you've experienced, or is the flow of exchanges more, I would say, natural within tech companies?
It's a very good question because, well, let's start with how do people work together on digital products, and that's a whole topic on its own, right? And as long as I do my job or my work, I see these problems everywhere. How do people work together, and how good, and how do people try to understand other stakeholders in the project, etc., etc. So this is still a big problem space. And what I find very interesting about this question is now we have these, well, not now, but finally we are talking much more about it. We have these fundamental environmental and societal problems that we need to solve to create and or make sure us and even more the next generations have a future. So how can we better work together on these problems, right? In an ecosystem like a company where we already have sometimes problems of working together in an efficient, or let's say better, in a good way, and that is a huge challenge. I think how can we bring people together, and that means not only people from one profession like the designers, but all the people, in my case, that are somehow involved in the digital product. And so one thing that I found is that we need to find ways and tools where we can gather people around. So one example from my work, I named it before, the user journey. The user journey is a tool UX designers use every time. It's a very good tool to bring in other people from other professions, because it's very easy to understand. If you have set up a user journey already, you can easily use it to discuss, like I said before, the negative consequences, the impacts of certain steps of the user journey with all kinds of stakeholders. And that's, I think, for us as designers, that's an important role that we have. I think we can be the connectors. We can help bringing people together and work together on these problems, because we have the tools that help to make things accessible and understandable for all kinds of different stakeholders.
And Thorsten, I understand that we have the tools. Both Sylvie and you've listed some in with different flavors and colors, which is very interesting. But do we have the mindset? Don't we have today still very often a pushback that everything that we do in a sustainable way is more expensive, is more complex, is more efficient, is more sexy, whatever? Isn't it that we are facing an issue with a narrative around sustainable design and beyond sustainability at large?
We definitely do, and that is a huge problem. We need a mindset shift in, well, at first, as I explained in the beginning, at first, for us as designers, how do we see our digital design, right? How do we see user experience? So that's a personal mindset shift for us. But we also need a mindset shift, and that's one of the big, I would say, societal questions. What is value in our society, right? And this is a huge economical, whatever, huge topic we could talk about for 2 hours. I don't want to make it too big here, but the thing is, as we said, the big problem is that, especially from the business side, there is the strong narrative that acting sustainable is a good thing, but it's expensive, and that it's not necessarily good for business. And well, the thing is, this is in fact not true. Sustainability is good for business. See Patagonia, for example. And what I also often say is that, especially in the EU, where regulations are coming, it's essential for your business to act sustainable, because otherwise you will get huge problems with regulations. And what I often do is I tell people or ask people, hey, you might have heard about the regulations about accessibility, about web accessibility, and all people know these challenges. And when I tell people, yeah, think about this, and the same thing will happen with web sustainability, for example, or with digital sustainability, and then people understand the need of doing these things. And I think it's important for us to work actively on changing these narratives, on helping people to understand, on stepping in and countering wrong narratives, because there are many wrong narratives, like sustainability is just expensive and nothing else. And this is also an important part, well, not only for designers, but for all of us, right? To step out of our comfort zone, to step out of our standard daily work. And I sometimes say it's not about designing the next product or the next experience. We need to use our gift, our tools, our knowledge to design the world around us. And we design things with stories. We are all storytellers. And there are so many wrong stories out in the world nowadays. And I think we need to use our gift to tell the true stories and to change narratives for good, actually. And this is a huge challenge I think we all face, not only designers, but where we as designers also can play an important role.
Staying with this mindset ID, something stuck into my mind, and it was something that we discussed also previously before this recording, is we need to reduce for everything we put in production, we should get rid of something else. And this is a very counterintuitive narrative compared to, I would say, the growth culture that is still the majority approach, I would say, in almost all companies and even public services. So, how do you manage to change a bit the perspective, to change a bit the mindset that, hey, when you release something, you should also consider getting rid of the equivalent, if not more, because as you said previously, Paris Agreement, minus 50% carbon emissions on top of many other environmental impacts to be reduced. So how do you help people having this slowly, I guess, painful change of mindset?
I wouldn't say that is a painful change of mindset. The point is, as I said, the companies are facing many new constraints. The first one is, as I say, the shortage of raw material and the fact that price of energy is incredibly increasing. So the point is, for the same amount of production, they pay more, and they cannot have the price of their product increase at the same way. So most of the time, the people that I meet are all already aware of the fact that they need to change the way their business is run today. They know that they are facing shortage. They are facing many other different issues, like the fact that the European Union decided to have a plan called the Fit 55, which means that they decide that our emission must have been reduced by 55% in 2030. So it's in 6 years. It means that we will probably have many, many new European rules, and companies know that they will need to be compliant with these new rules. So to me, they already know that they need to be much more sober than they used to. And they also need to find a way to keep their business still flourishing in a very difficult context. So to me, it's not a big deal, because people in the company, they are aware of all this. So all the questions they are asking today is, how can we have energy bills that are cheaper? How can we save energy? How can we do things better? Yeah, and also they need to recruit people, and it's very difficult to recruit young talent today if you're not engaged in a very social and environmental policy. So yes, it's also very good for their what we call the brand of the company.
So that's interesting because both of you've listed external pressures, so legal, recruitment issues, supplier prices as trigger for action. And eventually, it's not the question of how aware am I that climate change or biodiversity collapse is a threat to the survival of humankind, but it's, hey, it's already on us, so we have to do something. But to do something, we need to embrace a new way of thinking, and kind of reincorporating those external constraints is, in a way, to design things, design products, and design services. Am I right to draw this parallel between what you've said, both of you?
Exactly the point. It's not about a moral point of view. It's much more about a business concern.
One problem that I see very often is that I agree with you, Sylvie, that there is the awareness of the, let's say, the big problem of the climate catastrophe, for example. What I see is very often a missing awareness on the level of, okay, but what's my part in this in detail? Change, unfortunately, still is too often driven by economic pressure. That's a way we all need to use to push business leaders and decision makers. But I would also love to have this discussion about, okay, what can be additional values to the existing ones, or to the existing big value of growth that we have, and how can we align them with these? And I have no answer to these, but I think that's a core question we should work on, or have to work on.
And there is also the question of the timing of this value. My point being, what we value today, like making energy affordable for the entire humankind, was a very core value of the development policy in the UN. And we realize now, and I think this is something that Sylvie, you told me before, that Very often in systemic design, today's problem are the consequences of yesterday's solutions, and the same goes if you go in the future. My point about affordable energy for everyone, which in itself is a goal that I would fully support, is that created a massive boom in energy extraction, and energy consumption was even an indicator of economic and societal progress. So when we value something today, how do we make sure, or how do we at least start thinking that it might not be what we value tomorrow? And it could be one of my final questions: how can some systemic design tool could help us answer this question of future versus present assessment of what is valuable?
I would say that probably we must not think about tools, we must think about process. Actually, the point is not only about tools, it's about the fact that you succeed to gather all the people around the table. It means that when you are organizing a workshop, and there are many, many tools that you can use in workshop, the big point of systemic design is you need to have people that represent all the parts that are involved in the problem, and you need to have them discuss and exchange, not only fight, but exchange, because the main point is you need to have in your workshop the people that will implement the solutions that they are thinking about. That's the main point. It means that it's not a top-down process where you have tools and you think about anything and you design by your own as a designer. The point is that your work is to make people work together, exchange and imagine different solutions, and from this work, they will implement themselves and leave themselves with the solution they came with. And that's the main difference, because in systemic design, you're not designing anything. You are just designing intervention into a system. And your work is to have people concerned. Hassan Osbegan said something that it is not ethical to intervene in a social technical system without the permission of the participant, of the parties, of the stakeholders, and without their active participation. And that's the main process that we follow. And we have many tools that we can use in workshops. It can be causal loop, where you show people how things are all connected. It can be leverage points inspired by the work of Donella Meadows, and where you can identify the places that are crucial to change the system. It can be many different kind of workshop tools as designers used to have, because most of the time we have many, many tools. But the main point is how can we gather people that are representing all the parts of the system. And our job is mainly a facilitator. We reformulate, we synthesize, we plan, we organize, but we are not designing a system.
So a designer in systemic design doesn't design, but structure the discussion about the system.
Yes, and the intervention into the system.
And I really love the question about bring everyone around the table, which leads me to something super connected. Who's representing the future generations? And that might sound a bit crazy, but actually, I know that in Wales, for instance, you've got a commissioner for future generation, which means that someone whose job is to speak on the behalf of the people who are not yet there. Thorsten, is it something that you played a bit with? Because you mentioned it's very similar to what Sylvie described, but it was at the very beginning of the episode when you mentioned mapping all the actors, etc. Did you ever happen to map someone from the future?
Not yet, but I love the idea this because I think it's a different level. And the first thing I wanted to say was, okay, there are so many, if looking from a UX perspective and looking from, we are focusing on the users so much, there are so many actors from now that are underrepresented or not represented in all the work we do as UX designers. So there is so much work to give them a voice.
So, for both of you, my idea might sound a bit crazy, but you could actually leverage it as an overtone window move, which is you arrive in the workshop and you say, and by the way, we need to gather everyone, including everyone from the future. And then you've got this big like, what? Okay, okay, I got it. So not everyone from the future, but at least everyone from the present. Okay, that's good enough. That's good enough. And suddenly, boom, you've got a big win. Anyway, Sylvie, in your book, there is this chapter, system archetype chapter, which I love so much because it's so useful to modelize big interaction, etc., etc. But my question is, did you ever manage to use it to go back to, I don't know, some executive committee, a mayor, a city council, whoever, and say, okay, the issue you're facing at the moment is tragedy of the common, is winner wins all, is how actionable are these systemic archetype?
The point that we exchanged was the fact that Peter Senge was the writer of a book called The Fifth Discipline, identify, I would say, pattern, because there are patterns that in system that are not working. Okay, these are patterns of dysfunctional system. One of them is called the tragedy of the commons, and most of the time it's something that you can meet when you have a common good for people and everyone is using it, and at the very end there is no more left for other people. It can be water, it can be whatever. And what is interesting in Peter Senge's work is that for each pattern we called archetype of this dysfunctional system, he also identifies strategy. So the way that you can intervene in such dysfunctional system. Most of the time, we, as the systemic designer, know them, but we do not necessarily put them on the table with the client because sometimes they are very complex and the client is not able to handle it. It's not an easy tool that you can use in a workshop. So most of the time, we as designer have this pattern in our mind, and it helps us also to identify the good strategy. But it's not necessarily a tool that we share with all the people around the table, which is different from, I would say, a persona or a customer journey that most of the time are very publicly edited and publicly, yes, displayed.
So my first thought actually was that taking the user journey or something else is something that is highly manipulated by many people and we want many people on the table. I still think, from my very personal experience in doing many workshops, that as a good workshop facilitator, right, you are moderating, but you're also leading the workshop. And there are quite often you have the situations where, as Sylvie also said, we have the situation where we don't say anything that or everything that we know, but try to lead, try to give the context that is helpful without throwing everything to the table. And I think we do this as well. Also, if we work on a user journey, we want to bring all the stakeholders to the table, and we use this tool to common ground to work on. I think still we as the designer, we are not giving up all of the control of the situation. So therefore, my thought was that it's not so, maybe not so different, because if we would give up full control of the tools that we use and let everybody do whatever they want to do, it won't work, right? And so maybe it's not so different. I don't know if this is a good answer, but that are my thoughts, actually.
So this is definitely a good answer. And I think we can close our very deep discussions on all these tools. And actually, the focus that should be a bit less on the tools and a bit more on the mindsets and in the way we gather people rather than just focusing on the tool. Because, of course, if you gather just two people in the room with the most beautiful tool, I think we will miss the point with systemic design approach. So thanks a lot, both of you. But before you leave, I'd like to ask the traditional closing question, which is, would you like to share with the listeners one positive piece of news that you heard or that you got recently on our track to create a more sustainable world? And it doesn't have necessarily to be digital related, but of course, if it's digital related, it's always good. Who would like to start?
I can start. I have two ideas in my mind. The first one is an article from UN that I read recently about the fact that the Sahel is regreening. That for many reasons. The first one, that they have more rain there, and the second one is because they changed the way they grow plants. So yes, for me it's very good news. And the other one is about regenerative hydrology, which is a subject I explored recently, and there are many very interesting experiments. So yes, it's very encouraging.
One thing that immediately came into my mind, and which is not directly connected to ecological questions, is, I mean, you might know that here in Germany we have a huge topic with a right wing extreme party, and there was this research recently about a meeting, and horrible things have been discussed there. And what gives me a lot of hope is seeing how many people going on the streets last weekend, the weekend before, and so 100,000 of people going out there. So the majority of the people has the right mindset, and maybe we all have different ways how to do things in detail, but we have the right mindset, and it's about how can we activate people, how can we make people understand, okay, here's a problem, we need to tackle this, and seeing that, okay, so many people understanding here is a huge problem, and this is a dramatic problem, and we need to act now. And then people leave their comfort zone and go out to the streets. So it, like, similar to what we have seen with the Fridays for Futures some years ago. Seeing this power of the people gives me a lot of hope, and it gives me a lot of hope to see, yeah, we have to find ways to activate people for the for these major problems that we have, but it is possible.
Yeah, and because they're a minority, they tend to be more vocal than the majority. But yeah, the majority of people, they're just good folks, especially when it's about surviving or making our species survive. Surviving, sorry. Okay, so thanks a lot, both of you. It was very interesting to have you on the show. I think I'm going to reread your book, Sylvie, with a new angle, and re-listen some of your talk, Thorsten, with the same approach. I think the overall approach and the mindset with which we should embrace this complexity of understanding things in a systemic way rather than in a narrow, in silo way. Yeah, that was enlightening. So thanks a lot, both of you, for being in the show. And as usual, all the references to the books, the articles you've mentioned, etc., will be put in the show notes. And now it's time to say goodbye. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gaël. Thank you, Sylvie. Really enlightening for me as well.
Thank you very much, Gaël. And thank you, Thorsten. It was nice.
Thank you for listening to this Green IO episode. In the next episode, we will talk about norms and standards. This is what everyone is asking for in the Green IT community. We want clarity on norms, clarity on standards, clarity on what is truly required. And I realized that, hey, not sure what is actually a standard or norms. So I will be joined by Audrey Himmer, who's a former lead at AFNOR, the French representative of the ISO network, to talk about what are the norms and the standards which could be applied in the digital sustainability area, but most importantly, how do you build a norm? How do you build the standards? Who are the stakeholders? How does it all work? And why do we have different standards, different norms? What are the different approaches, etc.? So that's a very unusual episode, but that will bring light on a much needed topic that a lot of us are requiring to boost digital sustainability. And before you leave, a small message from our sponsor. No, I'm kidding. Green IO remains a free and independent podcast, so we still need your help to keep it that way. We have zero marketing budget, so you can really support us by spreading the word. Rate the podcast 5 stars on Apple and Spotify. Very useful as well is when you share an episode on social media or directly with a relative. It's a very good idea. So thanks a lot for your support. It means a lot to us. Us being me, but also Tanya Levitt, our amazing podcast producer, and Gilles Tellier, our amazing podcast curator. And of course, stay tuned by subscribing to Green IO on your favorite podcast platform or via the Green IO newsletter. The link is in the episode notes, but you already know the drill. Each month, you will get more insights and premium content to help you, the responsible technologists scattered all over the world, build a greener digital world, one bite at a time.